push the record.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mikko, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for having me here. It's exciting. As Mikko said, my life in the public sphere, so to say, has been kind of twofold. I was, and I still consider myself to some extent as a journalist, or a recovering journalist, as they say in the US, I think. That's something you can probably never completely abandon. But then when I over 10 years ago became somehow maybe bored or burnt out and all that, the stuff of glossy magazines, you know, career change and all that, then I decided to go into consulting and later on in research. We lived in the US for 4 years, and that's when I kind of had to invent myself once again, and I decided to have a research look on the things I had encountered and thought of as a professional in journalism and in consulting, and that's how I came to kind of be intrigued with the concept of dialogue. But without further delay, I think we tried to troubleshoot a little bit with the technology here. This probably, the poor performance that you're about to see reflects my current state of technology. I've kind of gone back to the very basics of communication, people talking to people, face to face, sitting in a circle. And that's what dialogue basically is all about. It's very simple. It's listening, learning, sitting in a circle, not even always talking, which the next video will hopefully show you, if I manage to get it working. Just a moment. I hope you got some kind of an impression of what was going on. It was, as I promised, people sitting in a circle. They were in a crypt of a church. This was something we organized with the church a few years ago. We invited people in from very various backgrounds and tried to facilitate thoughtful listening dialogue on topical issues such as mental health, unemployment, national symbols. This is very much of what happens in dialogues, with the exception that in this event we introduced art and also a third important element, which was a glass of wine and snack in the end. So it was sort of an event that combined art, social interaction, and then the 2-hour dialogue. Sometimes it went into a 3-hour dialogue, which was my mistake as the facilitator, but no one left. So we had a bunch of these, and they were quite interesting. That's the sort of the scene of dialogue. And now I'll show my more boring slides. Just a moment. Do you see my slides now?
Yes, this is good.
Great. So dialogue journalism, what it is and what it could be. I hope we can go on to the what it could be part, at least in the discussion, and I hope to share some ideas what I've been pondering about recently about dialogue and public discourse. So we all know this. It's about the current media environment. It's about fake news, alternative facts, hate news, attempts of coups and all that, post-truth, echo chambers, social divides. There's a crisis. We don't have to go into this in detail. I became interested as dialogue as a social innovation method, and then moved forward as a method of looking at it as a method for building trust between people and between audiences and journalism, and then also to look at what kind of speech is produced for in terms of content for the media. And what I've been doing, I'm calling this consultancy and activism, because in the end, sending a bill is a very, I mean, invoice for the organizer is the sad part of it. It's not a real business. My real business, if I have one, is mostly in different kinds of processes, very much related to dialogue and cooperation, but the public discussion part is the difficult bit. And I will come to that a little bit later. But I've helped media and NGOs to organize dialogues, and what I do is I try to sell the concept, what it is about, help design an event, for example, the one that you just saw, and then help the organizers, which I sometimes am part of, and sometimes a little bit distanced from it. The actual organizing part, I try to help in inviting the right people and facilitating the event. And I always try to introduce the idea that there's something valuable happening in these dialogues, that in terms of public discourse, that there are things that are valuable enough to come to broader light, away from the crypt. And that's how I try to promote the idea that maybe we should have a journalist in. In some cases, we tried social media influencers. And this requires usually talking not only to the organizers, but also to the editors and the media organizations, the journalists, to try to convince them that there is something valuable, even if it's a little bit difficult to point a finger in terms of what's news. I've also held dialogues with journalism students in Haga-Helia University, and I've also used dialogue as a research method. I wrote a report, or actually a couple of reports, for an advocacy group based on dialogues with children with cancer and their parents. And that was, in my opinion, also very fruitful, not exactly journalism, but related to publicizing what happens when people meet in a dialogue-like setting. So for me, it's a tool for facilitating fruitful encounters, but also it has a deeper meaning in terms of philosophy. I'll just go that into a second later. This is the research bit. So I consult, I research, I'm a social activist. So this is the research bits where I've applied theory of dialogue in my research. This is all online, so if you want to have a look at this at some point, please do. Why dialogue as such? It's something that we all strive at. We think that it's necessary. Let's have dialogue. You hear that almost everywhere these days, but when you look at it a little bit deeper, a few people define it. Few people make distinctions to discussion, debate, deliberation. So I wanted to use the concept of dialogue in more theoretical strength, so to say. And initially I used social innovation theory, like Senge and Isaacs and Bohm and Otto Scharmer, like Fifth Discipline and U theory and that kind of stuff. And then later I've added Martin Buber's philosophy on dialogue, which you might be somewhat familiar of. His book I and Thou is a classic of one line of dialogic philosophy. He maintains that the dialogic relationship between you and me is somehow fundamental to the human existence, and we should strive at seeing the other person without instrumental needs and objectives. And this is dialogue. Dialogue is when this happens, and it happens seldom. Most of our lives we live in instrumental relationships. We treat people as instruments of our own needs, and that's normal. That's nothing bad as such, but we also should remember that there is another side of humanity, and that's the encounter of I and Thou, an encounter free of preconditions. Some definitions there, you probably all are aware of this, so I'm not going to go deep into this. You can have these slides later on. So dialogue in practice, in brief, is listening, learning, sharing experiences, which is very important. Not only sharing information and knowledge, but sharing what happened to you and me. This is something I did actually like more than a year ago. I'm there in the photo only because I think the photographer was a little bit shy of taking photographs of the other participants. And even though he had the permission to do so and quote the people. But we invite diverse groups of people to discuss a timely topic. And we invite journalists to come in and sit in with in the circle. So we invite them to abandon their kind of normal journalistic role and come into the discussion more as a person. The other participants are usually very okay if you introduce the journalist by saying that we think that what happens here is valuable, and we think that we should give the journalist an opportunity to join in and see to himself if there is something valuable. And we usually agree that they're free to join, but only in terms of off the record during the actual dialogue. But later on, they are welcome to interview people on the basis of what they've heard and what they've learned. So photos usually okay, no quotes from the dialogue as such, but then later on we kind of free the journalist to do his journalistic job as a journalist usually does in his professional role. There are a number of different kinds of ways and models of doing this out there, and some of them resemble more the actual circle model of dialogue. Sometimes people eat, sometimes they have workshops, and that kind of goes on to the other end of the collaboration sort of line. I think these can be analyzed and seen in terms of the concept of dialogue, but of course there are a little bit different kinds of dialogues compared to the circle model. Some practices. This particular picture is from a dialogue the Time magazine and Advance Local organized in the US on guns as American culture. And we know that it's of course a very hot topic, and people are in each other's throats over gun rights. And they organized an invite-only dialogue, a 2-day dialogue in the museum in DC when it was still there. They tried to create a safe space where people could speak of their experiences of guns and why they think what they think of guns, how they feel and what they've experienced. And oftentimes these kind of dialogues are held outside newsrooms, like in places like libraries and churches are, or museums or schools or community centers. Oftentimes the facilitation comes from a third partner because the journalists themselves don't feel like that's their role. But I've seen journalists facilitate, so it's not unheard of. Professional journalism, I think, is very much what this is about in comparison to citizen journalism as citizen production. So this is a professional journalism practice. It's not so much about people producing their own news. Why dialogue perhaps is somewhat popular in this country is because of maybe coincidences, maybe cultural factors, but to a large extent due to the Finnish Innovation Fund creating this timeout model for dialogue, for discussing societal issues and in a respectful and safe manner. This happened around 5 years ago. I was part of the developing group, so that's why this this particular model has come into my practices. Before that, we used very similar methods, but they were called with different names. But when Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, kind of service designed it and branded it, it's no more. Oftentimes, there's no point of calling it something else because people relate to this. They have heard of it at least. Some people have even participated. There have been hundreds, if not thousands of them over the years for now. The model is sort of run by a separate foundation funded by big Finnish cultural foundations like Suomen Kulttuurirahasto and so forth. So it's a dialogue model, pretty easy to learn, from 1 to 2 hours. You're given rules for the facilitation. You're given ground rules like this, which are very simple, kind of no-brainers. Listen to the others, relate to others. This is often something that comes very naturally. He said this, and now I'm going to say this. So create knowledge by relating to others. Tell about your experience, not what you're the expert of. Talk to others directly, confront them if necessary. It's not supposed to be like a consensus forum. You can disagree. Be present and find things and bring together, kind of try to see what's common in the group. So what works in my experience? I think the concept as such is, in its simplicity, it's a great method for listening and learning and sharing experiences. It works very well in sort of creating a space where diverse people can meet. And by diversity, I mean things like the minister and the plumber, the educated and the not so educated, the ethnic population and the ethnic minorities and stuff like this. It brings an atmosphere, it creates an atmosphere where people share what they are as people, not what they are as their role. Somehow it works. And it produces the kind of speech where experience is in the center. I have seldom seen big conflicts or actually conflicts at all. There are kind of disagreements, but the question I sometimes hear whether people are kind of tempted to take advantage of the space to drive their agenda. It very rarely happens, so for a reason or the other. And finally, which is very important in my opinion, is that it's a deep and personal experience for the participants. And then if you look at the challenges, a deep and personal experience that I'm not very capable of speaking about when someone asks is not great news, to be honest. It's not great news that people agreed for a change, and that they didn't kill each other, that they didn't attack each other, that they didn't end up in a terrible mess. It's not something that, as from a journalistic point of view, is very tempting. And if you're tempted, if they are tempted to come or even organize a dialogue, they see it as a one-off project. It's not something that they usually see as something that they will be doing in the long run. And there, it still remains to be seen whether attitudes and practices really change if you come into this kind of a project and experiment. Is it going to change anything? And it's a time-consuming practice. So finally, before I'm ready for any discussion or dialogue or questions, I would like to kind of throw in the air a few wild ideas of what we could do from the kind of the basis of dialogue philosophy and practice. So we've used it as a kind of a response to polarization. What about other issues? What about wars, and what about climate change and biodiversity and stuff like that? If we look at particularly the question of climate and biodiversity, Buber's question of who are the relevant parties we should listen at is, I think, quite intriguing when we think of the natural environment. Who are the entities that don't have a voice? Who are kind of the entities that speak but not in our language? Are they people? Are they groups of people? Probably. Are they animals? Are they plants? Are they the natural environment? How about the non-living nature? I think there's something in here that takes us into another level of listening and questioning who are participants of public discussion, public debate, or public dialogue. And what language should journalism use to have these voices raised? And finally, do we always need the voices that we're used to using speech? And I'm getting back to the short video where we had music. Do we use the right methods of getting messages conveyed? Is there a body language of journalism? What's the role of silence and mere listening in public discourse? So those are the weird hippie questions I'd like to conclude with, and I'm happy to hear any comments or questions.
Yes.